welcome back to my channel. I realise it has been a very long time since I last did a video, so apologies for that. Just haven't had the time and I've been hyper-focusing on other things, so it's just slipped by. But I haven't forgotten, I am still doing this channel. It's just, you know, maybe there might be quite long gaps between videos. So in this video, I wanted to review an article that I've read recently entitled Autism Spectrum Disorder in ICD-11, a critical reflection of its possible impact on clinical practice and research, molecular psychiatry, and it's published this year, 2024, so a very recent article. I found it on nature.com. So this article compares and contrasts the clinical criteria for autism spectrum disorder in DSM-5 and the newly published ICD, that stands for International Classification of Diseases, ICD-11. So in contrast to DSM-5, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, in contrast to DSM-5, ICD-11 allows a high variety in symptom combinations. It's in favour of an extremely diverse picture, possibly at the expense of precision. This can hardly be differentiated from other mental disorders and autism-like traits. ICD-11 moves away from an observable behavioural and neurodevelopmental disorder to a disorder of inner experience that can hardly be measured objectively. So this is very problematic, I feel, because autism is not an identity. It's not something. You're not excuse me. You're not autistic because of a feeling inside you of difference, of isolation. Because of course, many people, particularly in our modern isolating societies, many people have a kind of subjective feeling of isolation, of loneliness, and of course every single autistic characteristic can be found in non-autistics. Every single characteristic. There's not a single autism trait that a non-autistic at some point in their life does not experience. So there has to be something more than just a subjective feeling of difference. Autism has to be something objective. It has to be observable. There has to be some metric there that can distinguish autism, which after all is a cognitive deficit. You have to start, as Uta Frith said, the neuroscientist Uta Frith says, you know, you have to start at the cognitive level, because that's where you'll find autism, essentially. That's how you can distinguish autism from other mental disorders and just from run-of-the-mill normality. So moving away from an observable behavioural neurodevelopmental disorder to a disorder of inner experience is very treacherous, I would argue. So this article says that ICD-11 is full of vague and subjective concepts that can lead to a non-falsifiable diagnosis. And this results in a danger of false positive diagnosis. A false positive, by the way, simply means someone who's been diagnosed autistic who isn't actually autistic. Now, we have to allow that this does happen. It happens in every single psychiatric disorder. There seems to be a taboo around mentioning the possibility that it occurs in autism diagnoses, but we have to allow it can and does happen. After all, people often talk about misdiagnoses in other disorders, like people getting misdiagnosed with personality disorders seems to be a big one. But they never allow for the fact that actually people can and do get misdiagnosed as having autism. I would say this is a fringe concern in some ways, in that historically the problem in autism has more been that of underdiagnosis, but I do feel that there is a possibility that we're moving potentially in the other direction in order to overcompensate for the historic underdiagnosis of autism, that we're possibly moving too far in the other direction, where there may well be an increase in false positives. The question there is, to what extent does this matter? And that's a question of philosophical debate. I've argued, and I carry on arguing, that diagnosis is very important and that people should get the right support, and that it's better for the net to be too wide than it is for it to be too narrow. However, there is a problem when autism becomes so wide that the very concept itself becomes diluted to the null. So where you have people who can't really be distinguished too much from one-of-the-mill eccentric normality. These are very successful people, often with families. Obviously you can have a family and be autistic. I'm saying it's not one thing, I'm just saying it's the whole picture. You know, basically aren't really that impaired. They're able to have families and often have very highly successful careers and often have quite good social lives, who often claim that they're not impaired socially. I mean, come on, I mean, that's a whole definition of autism, but seriously, lots of people do claim that these days, and this is really troubling for people who actually are very impaired. But anyway, that's a whole other debate. So, because it basically results in the whole concept being trivialised and people not actually getting what actual autism is, and that is quite problematic. So that's potentially one of the dangers of that. So, danger of false positive diagnosis, increasing the non-specificity of treatments. So if autism becomes so broad that it doesn't really mean anything anymore, because basically it covers so many different phenotypes, then that can affect treatment delivery, because you know, you're going to lose precision. So these treatments are going to be very vague, they're going to be very generic, because you're covering so many different bases. That's very problematic. It can also mean that the specificity of ASD is reduced in research, so the replication of studies will be hampered, and this could limit our understanding of the etiology and the biological pathways. I mean, I'd argue that, you know, the whole idea that there's one cause of autism is just, you know, that's very naive. Obviously, autism isn't caused by just one thing. There are many different biological pathways that can result in autism. It's very, very complex. I'd argue that there are subgroups. But, you know, if the net is so wide, this is going to make this very difficult to disentangle. You know, yeah, I mean, autism has different causes, that's true, but if you widen the net to such an extent, it's going to be really difficult in research, isn't it? Because you're just going to have so much data, and it's going to be, what is this thing, you know? You have to narrow it down somehow. So yeah, the article does argue here that we do need an identification of core ASD subtypes just to bring some clarity, some sense to this chaos. Now, it also argues that lately the concepts of neurodiversity and the social model of disability have gained prominence, and they've challenged the traditional ideas about ASD as a disorder. So under the neurodiversity paradigm, difficulties are not understood as a deficit, but rather as a poor fit between the individual characteristics and the demands by the environment. And this conceptualisation is defined by strengths rather than deficits, so the ASD diagnosis offers a person a positive identity and active community. Now, you know my views on this because I've talked about this before. I'm very opposed to the neurodiversity paradigm. I think it's deeply damaging. No, autism is not an identity. It's a serious disability. It should not be treated with levity. It's, you know, focusing on strengths, that is just absolute, well, I mean, that's just capitalism for you, I guess. But at the end of the day, you know, you don't go to a doctor to talk about strengths. You go to a doctor because you have a deficit, because you have a disorder that you need help with. I'm fully aware of what my strengths are. I'm a human being. Every human being has a strength. We don't need to be told you have strengths. That's patronising as crap, as fuck, guess the word. Yeah, you know what I mean. It's patronising AF. It's, you know, we don't go to the doctor to be told what our strengths are, because I know what my strengths are. I go to the doctor for help with my problems. Autism is not an identity for me. It's a problem. It holds me back. If it was an identity, if it was just like a quirk, I wouldn't need a diagnosis. And I wish that was the case. You know, it'd be great, wouldn't it, if I could see it as this amazing positive aspect of myself that I don't need help with. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But that is not the reality. And yes, it is a disorder. It is. I mean, it just is. I'm sorry, but it is. And when it says, you know, your neurodiversity paradigm, autism is understood not as a difficulty, so understood not as a deficit, but rather as a poor fit between the individual's characteristics and the demands made by the environment. That is very naive and very ableist, because it's coming at it from a very privileged, non-impaired perspective. I mean, if you're lucky enough that your only problem is a poor fit between you and the environment, you're doing pretty good. But my problems exist all the time. They never go away. It doesn't matter what environment I'm in. I could be in a perfect environment for me, and I'd still be impaired. I still have a problem. I still wish I wasn't autistic, because those problems follow me around. They do not leave me, okay? Now, if that's true for me, because I don't think I'm a minority, I'm pretty certain that that's also the case for other people. So this blows the whole neurodiversity paradigm right out of the water, because they're going to have to allow that this paradigm does not fit every single person. And if it doesn't fit every single person, there are real problems with the paradigm, because it shows it only fits a very niche, elitist group of people who can just bugger off, because what they say does not affect people like me. Okay, I hope I've made that very clear. So, okay, got that one out. Okay, so, yeah. So, as it says in the article, a gap has emerged between considering ASD a disorder and a diversity identity. And it says that the heterogeneity of autism can affect research by hindering the explanatory power of ASD diagnosis to discover treatments. It says that the ICD-11 defines ASD by a great amount of possible but not mandatory features, and it does not give any advice concerning a number of symptoms that is necessary for a diagnosis, whereas the DSM-5 is a lot more precise about exactly what symptoms a person needs. And this means that the clinical utility of the ICD-11, the clinical utility of the ICD-11 is questionable, as this conceptualisation can hardly be differentiated from other mental disorders. It can hardly be measured objectively, as it contains many vague concepts, e.g. compensation, or symptoms that are only apparent in retrospect. And this leads to non-falsifiable diagnosis, as it annuls the significance of any observable behavioural features, resulting in false positives. Okay, so I'm going to move over to video number 2 now to carry on, so this video doesn't run out of me, to carry on going through this article. I might have to come back to this possibly, we'll see how we get on. So moving over to video number 2 now.